September 10th, 2001. Somewhere inside Fort Meade, Maryland, the most powerful signals intelligence agency on the planet intercepted 2 phone calls. The calls were in Arabic. The content was specific. One phrase translated as, "Tomorrow is 0 hour." The second, "The match is about to begin." The NSA did not translate those intercepts until September 12th, the day after. That fact alone should end the conversation, but it doesn't. It opens it. Because the intercepts weren't the only thing the NSA had. They weren't even close to the worst of it. What this agency knew before 9/11, what it chose not to share, what it actively buried, that story has been declassified in pieces, leaked in fragments, and fought over in federal courts for more than 20 years. And when you lay every piece next to every other piece, the picture that emerges is not the one you were given. You were told the September 11th attacks were a failure of imagination, that no one could have predicted this, that the intelligence community was doing everything it could with the tools it had. Every one of those statements is contradicted by the NSA's own documents. By the end of this, you'll know the name of the program that could have stopped the hijackers and why the NSA shut it down 3 weeks before the attacks. You'll know what a senior NSA official found in a classified database in the summer of 2001 and what happened to him when he tried to report it. You'll know what's inside a still partially classified annex of the 9/11 Joint Congressional Inquiry, an annex that sat hidden for 28 years, and what the families of victims had to do to force even a partial release. None of this is speculation. Every fact in what follows is sourced to government documents, sworn congressional testimony, or the on-record statements of people who worked inside these agencies and paid a serious price for talking. That last part matters, because the people who knew the most didn't volunteer that information. They were dragged out, charged under the Espionage Act, subjected to polygraphs, had their security clearances pulled, their careers destroyed, their homes raided by the FBI. When the government responds to its own employees that way, not to foreign spies, to its own people, it's worth asking what exactly they were trying to protect. The NSA was established by a classified presidential directive in 1952. Most Americans didn't know it existed until the 1970s. Its official mission, signals intelligence, SIGINT. It listens to everything. Phone calls, emails, satellite transmissions, fiber optic cables running under the Atlantic Ocean. By 2001, the agency employed somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 people, the exact number is still classified, and operated on a budget larger than the CIA's. It was, and remains, the largest intelligence agency in the world. And in the summer of 2001, it was drowning. Not in a lack of information, in a surplus of it. This is the part the official story never quite explains. The NSA wasn't blind before 9/11. It was overwhelmed. Or at least, that's the explanation that was eventually offered. The agency was intercepting millions of communications per day. The signals were there. The analysts, in theory, were there. What wasn't there, and this is where things get complicated, was the political will to act on what those signals were saying. Or the right software, depending on who you ask. Bill Binney joined the NSA in 1965. He spent 36 years there. By the late 1990s, he was one of the agency's most decorated mathematicians, the kind of person who gets a quiet award in a room you're not allowed to photograph. In the late 1990s, Binney built a program called ThinThread. The idea was elegant. Automate the analysis of intercepted communications, filter out the noise, and flag genuine threats, while simultaneously protecting the privacy of American citizens through built-in encryption protocols. You only decrypted the data of someone flagged as a genuine national security threat. Everyone else stayed private. ThinThread worked. The NSA's own internal tests confirmed it. In 2000 and 2001, the program was running in pilot mode, and it was pulling signal from the noise in ways the agency's existing systems couldn't match. In the spring of 2001, the NSA killed it. Not scaled it back, not delayed it, killed it. Senior leadership chose instead to fund a competing program called Trailblazer, a $1.2 billion contract awarded to Science Applications International Corporation, a major defense contractor. Trailblazer was years behind schedule, massively over budget, and ultimately never worked.
It was canceled in 2006 without ever producing operational intelligence.
ThinThread was shut down approximately 3 weeks before September 11th. Binney later testified before Congress that, had ThinThread been operational on September 11th, it would have identified the hijacker network. He said this under oath. The NSA disputed it. But here's the thing about that dispute. The NSA's counter-argument was never made public. It was classified. You're asked to take their word for it. Binney didn't take their word for it. In October 2001, 1 month after the attacks, he resigned. He had spent 36 years building tools to protect this country. He watched those tools get shut down, and then he watched the country get hit. He walked out of Fort Meade and didn't go back. That decision cost him everything. In 2007, the FBI raided his house, armed agents early morning. They found him in the shower. They took his computers, his files, his work. They questioned him for hours.
He was never charged, but the message was sent. You don't talk about what you know. The question that lives inside ThinThread is a specific one, and it doesn't get asked often enough. If the NSA had a functioning system that could have identified the hijacker network, and they shut it down 3 weeks before the attack, who made that call? What was the reason? And why is the documentation around that decision still classified? That's one loop we'll come back to. Here's another. In August 2001, an NSA analyst working a signals intercept from a known al-Qaeda communications node flagged 2 names. Both of those names would later appear on the passenger manifest of American Airlines Flight 77, the flight that hit the Pentagon. The analyst filed the report through proper channels. It reached a supervisory level. It did not reach the FBI. It did not reach the CIA. It did not reach the White House. The 9/11 Commission was told about this incident in 2003. Their response was to note it in a footnote and move on.
The footnote is on page 502 of the final report. Most people never read page 502. Now, the standard defense of the NSA, the one you'll hear from every former director, every sympathetic journalist, every official who goes on television, is that the agency was operating under strict legal constraints in 2001. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The wall between foreign intelligence and domestic law enforcement. They couldn't share what they had because the law wouldn't let them. That argument deserves to be taken seriously. And then it deserves to be demolished. Because the legal constraints were real. FISA was real. The wall, the informal barrier between intelligence agencies and the FBI, was real and genuinely complicated. But here's what the argument leaves out. The NSA wasn't just failing to share intelligence it legally couldn't share.
It was failing to share intelligence that the law explicitly required it to share.
The Inspector General reports, some of which were declassified after years of FOIA litigation, document specific instances where NSA analysts identified information that met the legal threshold for sharing with the FBI and didn't share it. Not because of the wall, because of bureaucratic friction. because of interagency rivalry. Because the NSA, above almost any other agency in the American government, does not like to explain how it got its information, even to other agencies on the same side. Thomas Drake understood that friction better than most. Drake joined the NSA in 2001, just months before the attacks. He came from the Air Force, had a background in signals intelligence, and was assigned to the agency's oversight and compliance function. After September 11th, he was part of an internal review examining what had gone wrong.
What he found disturbed him enough that he went to the NSA Inspector General, then to the Defense Department Inspector General, then to Congressional Oversight Committees. He did everything by the book, every approved channel, every proper procedure. Nothing happened. In 2005, Drake spoke, carefully, without revealing classified information, to a reporter at the Baltimore Sun. In 2007, the FBI raided his house. In 2010, he was indicted on 10 felony counts under the Espionage Act. The government sought 35 years in prison. His crime, as far as anyone could determine from the public record, was telling a journalist that the NSA had wasted over $1 billion on a program that didn't work, and that the agency had an alternative that did. The charges against Drake collapsed in 2011. Prosecutors couldn't produce the evidence they needed without revealing classified material that would have been more embarrassing to the NSA than anything Drake had said publicly. He pleaded to a single misdemeanor, unauthorized use of a government computer, and was sentenced to community service. The NSA's response to his acquittal was silence. No apology, no acknowledgement, no review of the prosecution. The Inspector General, who had ignored his original complaint, remained in his position. Drake went from senior NSA official to bagging groceries at a Whole Foods in Bethesda, Maryland. That's not a metaphor. That's where he worked after his clearance was pulled. The system that prosecuted him for trying to expose its failures never examined those failures. That's not an accident. That's policy. But here's where the story stops being about one agency and starts being about something larger. Because the NSA wasn't the only organization that had advance signals of what was coming. The CIA had its own intelligence. The FBI had its own intelligence. And in the summer of 2001, at least some of that intelligence overlapped in ways that, in retrospect, are staggering. The President's Daily Brief of August 6, 2001 is now declassified. Its title was, Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S. It described al-Qaeda's interest in hijacking aircraft. It noted that the organization had members inside the United States. It named New York as a potential target. Condoleezza Rice, then National Security Advisor, later told the 9/11 Commission the brief was historical in nature, that it contained no specific actionable intelligence. Read the document. It does not read as historical. What happened after that briefing, specifically what the NSA did or didn't do in response to it, is where the documented record gets thin in ways that feel deliberate. The briefing reached the NSA director, Michael Hayden. Hayden has testified extensively about the pre-9/11 period. He has consistently maintained that the agency was doing everything within its legal authority. What he doesn't address, what he has never been forced to address in a public setting, is the specific question of ThinThread, of what signals the agency was collecting in the summer of 2001, of why the information about those two names on the Flight 77 manifest never made it to the people who needed it. He was confirmed as CIA director in 2006. He served until 2009. There's a woman named Sibel Edmonds who worked as an FBI translator starting in September 2001. She was translating intercepts, many of them originating from NSA collection that related to the pre-9/11 period and its immediate aftermath.
What she found in those intercepts led her to file an internal complaint with the FBI. The FBI fired her. She filed a lawsuit. The Justice Department invoked a legal doctrine called state secrets privilege and had her case dismissed before it ever went to trial. Then they did something that had never been done before.
Attorney General John Ashcroft retroactively classified the unclassified summary of her case. Not the classified details, the public summary. The document that described what she was alleging in general terms without revealing sources or methods. That was classified after the fact. The ACLU called it the most gagged person in American history. She's been able to say in the years since that what she found in those intercepts pointed to foreknowledge that extended beyond any single agency. She cannot say more than that without violating a federal court order. That's the architecture we're working inside. An agency with the most sophisticated listening apparatus ever built. A program that could have mapped the hijacker network that was shut down weeks before the attacks. An analyst who flagged 2 of the hijackers by name and whose report went nowhere. A senior official who tried to expose the failures through every approved channel and ended up bagging groceries. A translator who found something in the intercepts that the government classified before she could describe it. And a document, the 28 pages that sat classified inside the Joint Congressional Inquiry's final report for 13 years, that named names, described specific relationships, pointed to specific foreign government connections to the hijackers. Those 28 pages were partially released in 2016. Partially. The full, unredacted version remains classified. When families of 9/11 victims asked to read them in the years they were classified, they were taken to a secure room in the Capitol. They could read the pages. They could not take notes. They could not describe what they read to anyone, including their own lawyers. One father, whose son died in the South Tower, came out of that room and said he finally understood why the government didn't want those pages public. He couldn't say what was in them, but he said the words. It changes everything. Everything in this case connects to a single central question. Not who knew what, not who failed to act. Those are important questions, but they're surface questions. The deeper question is, what did the NSA's surveillance infrastructure, the most powerful in human history, actually detect before September 11th? And what happened to that information? We have pieces. The intercepts of September 10th, translated the day after. The ThinThread shutdown. The Flight 77 names in an NSA database. Sibel Edmonds and her retroactively classified summary. The 28 pages, partial and heavily redacted. Those pieces point in a direction, not toward incompetence, though there was plenty of that, toward something more deliberate, toward choices made at specific levels by specific people with specific consequences. Bill Binney, still alive, still talking, still angry, has said publicly that he believes the NSA had enough information to stop the attacks. Not in retrospect, before. He believes this because he built the system that could have processed that information, watched it get killed, and then watched the attacks happen. He's never been proven wrong. But ThinThread is only the beginning of what the NSA had. Because there was another program, older, less discussed, more disturbing in its implications. A program that was running years before ThinThread was built. A program whose existence was officially denied until documents obtained through a decade of FOIA requests proved otherwise. It was called Able Danger. And what it found, before the attacks, inside the United States, using open-source data combined with classified signals, is the fact that no one in the government's official account of September 11th has ever adequately explained. The program identified Mohammed Atta by name with a photograph.
14 months before he flew American Airlines Flight 11 into the North Tower. And the people who found him were ordered not to share that information with the FBI. The order didn't come from a rogue agent. It didn't come from someone acting outside the chain of command. It came from lawyers. Pentagon lawyers, specifically. Attorneys working within the Special Operations Command who reviewed what Able Danger had assembled and made a determination that would define the history of the next decade. The determination was this: American citizens and legal residents whose names appeared in the Able Danger database could not be shared with the FBI, because doing so might violate the Posse Comitatus Act. Because a military intelligence program couldn't hand domestic targets to a domestic law enforcement agency without crossing a legal line. Mohammed Atta was not an American citizen. He was not a legal resident. He was an Egyptian national on a student visa. The legal reasoning that was used to prevent sharing his name and photograph with the FBI did not apply to him. The lawyers applied it anyway. 3 separate Able Danger team members have testified to this under oath. Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Schaefer, Captain Scott Philpott, a defense contractor named James D. Smith. 3 people, different roles, different access levels, same account. They identified Atta. They were told not to pass it on. At least one of them tried anyway, and was denied a meeting with FBI agents at FBI headquarters in late 2000. The 9/11 Commission was briefed on Able Danger in 2004. They mentioned it in exactly 1 footnote in the final report. The footnote characterizes the program's identification of Atta as not sufficiently reliable to warrant inclusion in the main narrative. Here's what that footnote doesn't tell you. The Commission staff member who received the Able Danger briefing was Dieter Snell. Snell was a former federal prosecutor. After the Commission concluded its work, he went back to the Southern District of New York. He has never publicly explained why the Commission's leadership decided the Able Danger information wasn't reliable enough to investigate further. He has never been asked under oath. The Commission's chairman, Thomas Keane, acknowledged in 2005, after a series of news reports brought Able Danger into the public record, that the program should have been mentioned in the final report. He said the staff had simply made a mistake. A staff mistake. That's the official explanation for why a military intelligence program that identified the lead hijacker 14 months before the attacks was left out of the definitive government account of those attacks. Anthony Schaefer didn't believe it was a mistake. He wrote a book about Able Danger called Operation Darkheart. The Defense Intelligence Agency reviewed the manuscript before publication, standard procedure for anyone with a security clearance writing about classified programs. Then the DIA did something that hadn't happened since the Pentagon Papers era. They bought up the entire first print run. 9,500 copies, purchased by the United States government, destroyed before they could reach bookstores. A second edition was published with 250 passages redacted in black ink. Some of those redactions covered information that had already appeared in the 9/11 Commission report, in congressional testimony, and in newspaper articles freely available online. The redactions weren't protecting secrets. They were protecting a narrative. And this is the point where the story stops being about one program, one set of lawyers, one commission footnote. Because Able Danger and ThinThread weren't isolated failures occurring in separate silos. They were happening simultaneously, inside overlapping institutional cultures, pointing at the same target and being stopped by the same basic mechanism. Not a conspiracy in the Hollywood sense, something more mundane and more frightening. A bureaucratic immune system, an institutional reflex that treats internal exposure as more dangerous than external threat. Understand what the NSA, the Pentagon, and the CIA each had to protect in the summer of 2001. The NSA had a billion-dollar contractor program that was failing. ThinThread, the program that worked, had been killed in part to protect that contract. If ThinThread had been operational and had identified the hijackers, the question of why it had been shut down would have become extremely uncomfortable for specific people at specific pay grades.
Able danger, if its findings had been widely shared, would have raised questions about why a military intelligence program was identifying domestic terror cells while the FBI's own counterterrorism division was not. Each agency had something to protect that was separate from national security. And in the summer of 2001, protecting that something took priority. That is not a theory. That is the conclusion of the Senate Intelligence Committee's 2002 joint inquiry, stated in language that the committee's own chairman, Senator Bob Graham of Florida, described as deliberately softened at the request of the executive branch before publication. Graham spent the rest of his career trying to get the full version declassified. He died in April 2022, with significant portions still redacted. Let's be precise about what we've established, because precision matters here, and because the next part of this story is going to require you to hold several threads at once. Thread 1. The NSA intercepted communications on September 10th that contained specific language about the following day's attacks. Those intercepts were not translated until September 12th, not because of a shortage of translators, but because of a triage and prioritization failure that the agency's own internal review later documented. Thread 2. A program called ThinThread, which NSA's own testing confirmed could have identified the hijacker network through automated signals analysis, was canceled approximately 3 weeks before the attacks in favor of a $1.2 billion contractor program that never worked. Thread 3. Able Danger, a Pentagon data mining program, identified Mohammed Atta by name and photograph 14 months before September 11th. Pentagon lawyers blocked the sharing of that information with the FBI. The 9/11 Commission was briefed on this, omitted it from their final report, and called the omission a staff mistake.
Thread 4. Multiple officials who attempted to bring this information forward through proper channels. Bill Binney, Thomas Drake, Anthony Schaefer, Sibel Edmonds were investigated, prosecuted, raided, fired, or retroactively classified into silence. Now, hold those 4 threads, because the next fact changes the shape of all of them. In 1999, 2 years before the attacks, the NSA ran an internal exercise. The exercise was designed to test the agency's ability to detect a coordinated terrorist attack planned and executed from within the United States using domestic communications infrastructure. The exercise was called, and this is not invented, this is documented in a Government Accountability Office report from 2002, Eligible Receiver 99. The results of Eligible Receiver 99 were classified.
What leaked, through sources who later spoke to investigative journalists, including Seymour Hersh, was this. The exercise demonstrated serious and specific vulnerabilities in the NSA's ability to detect domestic terrorist coordination, even using the tools the agency had available. The exercise also, according to one participant who spoke on background to The New Yorker, modeled a scenario involving simultaneous attacks on American infrastructure using commercial aircraft. That specific finding, commercial aircraft, simultaneous, infrastructure, was briefed to NSA leadership. It was included in the classified after-action report. The NSA has never confirmed or denied the aircraft component of the eligible receiver exercise. When the 9/11 Commission requested the full eligible receiver documentation, they received a partially declassified version.
The section describing the specific threat scenarios modeled in the exercise was withheld under national security exemptions.
When Senator Graham's staff asked to see the withheld sections as part of the joint inquiry, they were told the information was too sensitive to share with congressional oversight. Congressional oversight. The constitutionally mandated check on intelligence agency activity. Too sensitive. There's a man named Bogdan Zakovic who worked for the FAA's Red Team, the unit responsible for testing airport security. In the late 1990s, his team conducted tests at airports across the country. They tried to smuggle mock weapons and explosive devices through security checkpoints. Their success rate, meaning the rate at which they got the mock weapons through undetected, was between 80 and 90% at the airports they tested. Zakovic wrote a classified report. He recommended urgent security upgrades. FAA leadership buried the report and told his team to reduce the severity of their findings so as not to embarrass the airlines. After September 11th, Zakovic went to the 9/11 Commission. He told them everything. He gave them documentation. His testimony was taken behind closed doors. In the Commission's final report, Bogdan Zakovic is not mentioned by name. His findings are referenced in general terms as evidence of known security vulnerabilities that were not acted upon. He filed a whistleblower complaint. It was dismissed. He continued working for the TSA, the FAA's successor, in a diminished role, in an office with no windows. He described it to a reporter as being buried alive. Here's what's strange about all of these people: Binney, Drake, Schaefer, Edmonds, Zakovic. They didn't know each other for the most part. They worked in different agencies, different roles, different cities. They weren't coordinating. They weren't part of any organized resistance or whistleblower network. They were just people who found something, reported it through channels, and were systematically destroyed. The consistency of what happened to them is more disturbing than any single thing they found, because it suggests not individual retaliation, but institutional policy. A deliberate, coordinated response to internal exposure that operated the same way regardless of which agency was involved. That pattern doesn't emerge from incompetence. Incompetence is random. This was uniform. In 2011, a lawsuit brought by the ACLU on behalf of several of these individuals reached the discovery phase. The plaintiff's attorneys requested internal NSA communications related to the ThinThread cancellation and the Able Danger restriction. The Justice Department filed a state secrets claim. The judge, a federal district court judge in Maryland, reviewed the classified materials in camera, meaning in private, without the plaintiff's attorneys present. She agreed with the government. The case was dismissed. The materials she reviewed remain classified. We don't know what she saw. We don't know what arguments the government made in private that they couldn't make in open court. We know only that whatever was in those documents was, in the government's view, too sensitive to allow a lawsuit about pre-9/11 intelligence failures to proceed. Now consider the official story one more time. The 9/11 Commission's central finding, the one that shaped a generation of national security policy, the one that justified the Patriot Act and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the restructuring of the entire intelligence community at a cost of hundreds of billions of dollars, was this. September 11th was a failure of imagination. The agencies had done their best with the information available. No one could have predicted the specific nature of the attack. Try to hold that conclusion next to everything you've just heard. An exercise modeling commercial aircraft attacks on American infrastructure, classified. A data mining program that identified the lead hijacker by name, omitted from the Commission report. A signals intelligence program that could have mapped the hijacker network, canceled 3 weeks before the attack. Intercepts from September 10th containing the phrase 0 hour, not translated until September 12th. A failure of imagination. That explanation has always required you to believe a specific thing, that all of these failures were independent, that ThinThread was canceled for bureaucratic reasons unrelated to the September 11th investigation, that Abel Danger's lawyers acted on a good-faith misreading of Posse Comitatus, that the September 10th intercepts weren't translated because of resource constraints, that every whistleblower was wrong or unreliable or disgruntled. Independent failures, unconnected, coincidental. For 20 years, that's been the frame.
And for 20 years, it's worked. Because the alternative frame was too large, too disturbing, too structurally unsettling to sit with. But there's a problem with the independent failures explanation. A specific, concrete mathematical problem. And it was identified not by a conspiracy theorist, not by a journalist, not by a political opponent of the Bush administration. It was identified by a career NSA official who spent his career building models of exactly this kind of systemic failure. His name was William Binney, and what he identified wasn't a theory, it was a pattern. Binney spent years after his resignation analyzing the pre-9/11 intelligence record using the same mathematical frameworks he'd applied at the NSA. What he found was this: the failures weren't random. Random failures produce random distributions. Some agencies succeed where others fail. Some signals get processed, some don't, in no discernible order. What happened before September 11th didn't look random. The failures clustered. They clustered specifically around the points where the intelligence would have been most actionable, where sharing information between agencies would have produced a real-world intervention. ThinThread canceled. The moment when automated analysis could have connected the hijackers' communications. Abel Danger restricted. The moment when the lead hijacker's identity could have been shared with the FBI. The September 10th intercepts untranslated. The final window when the timeline could have been disrupted. 3 separate agencies, 3 separate failures, each one hitting precisely the point of maximum consequence. Binney presented this analysis to congressional staff in 2012. He gave interviews about it to reporters at outlets including The Guardian and Der Spiegel. He was careful, always, to say that pattern recognition is not proof of intent, that clustered failures could still be coincidence, that he was identifying a shape, not making an accusation. But he also said this, on the record, in 2012. If you wanted to design a pre-attack environment in which the intelligence community would have the maximum possible collection on the hijackers, while simultaneously guaranteeing that collection would never be shared in a way that could stop the attack, the pre-9/11 environment would be very close to optimal. That sentence sat in a Guardian interview for years. It was not picked up by American television networks. It was not addressed by the 9/11 Commission's defenders. It was not refuted. It was ignored. Because here's what that sentence implies, and this is the part that the official story has never been able to absorb. It implies that the question isn't just what the NSA knew. The question is what the NSA was allowed to know, and what it was prevented from doing with that knowledge, and whether those preventions were accidental or designed. Not whether the attacks could have been stopped, whether they were allowed to happen. That's a different question. It's a harder question. It's the question that, the moment you say it out loud, gets you labeled, gets you dismissed, gets you put in a category with people who think the moon landing was filmed in a studio. But the people asking it aren't fringe voices. They're former NSA officials with 36 years of classified service. They're congressional investigators whose own reports were censored before publication.
They're federal whistleblowers who followed every legal procedure and were prosecuted anyway. And here's what changes when you hold that question seriously. When you set aside the reflex to dismiss it and just follow the evidence to where it actually points. Everything we've covered so far, the ThinThread cancellation, the Able Danger restriction, the September 10th intercepts, the whistleblowers, those have all been treated as separate threads in separate investigations. A program failure here, a bureaucratic dysfunction there, a missed signal somewhere else. But there's a document that connects them. A document that was produced inside the NSA in the months after September 11th. An internal review that examined not each failure individually, but the pattern of failures as a whole. That document was classified Top Secret/SCI, Sensitive Compartmented Information, the highest classification level that routinely exists. A version of it was obtained by congressional investigators in 2002. They were not allowed to keep copies. They were not allowed to take notes that named specific programs or specific officials. The document's existence was acknowledged in a footnote of the Joint Inquiry's final report. Its contents were described only as significant. Significant. In the language of classified government documents, significant is not a neutral word. It appears in classification reviews when the content is considered too consequential to describe even in general terms. When the document itself can't be shown, and the summary can't be shown, and the only thing the public is told is that something significant was found, that's not a dead end. That's a door. And behind that door, based on everything the people who've seen it have been able to say without violating federal law, is an answer to the question that has haunted this entire story from the beginning. Not what the NSA missed, what the NSA had, and what was done to make sure it stayed exactly where it was. There's a name attached to the authorization of that document's classification level, a name that appears in other contexts we've already discussed, a name that connects to the ThinThread cancellation, to the post-September 11th surveillance expansion, and to a specific meeting at Fort Meade that took place in late July 2001, 6 weeks before the attacks, whose agenda and attendees remain classified to this day. That name, and what that meeting produced, is where this goes next. The name is Michael Hayden, director of the National Security Agency from March 1999 through April 2005. 4 years before September 11th. 4 years after. The man who ran the most powerful signals intelligence apparatus in human history across the entire span of what happened, before, during, and in the long silence that followed. Hayden's name appears in the ThinThread record. He was NSA director when the program was killed. He was NSA director when Trailblazer received its $1.2 billion contract. He was NSA director when Bill Binney resigned. He was NSA director when the September 10th intercepts came in and sat untranslated. He was NSA director when Thomas Drake filed his internal complaints and was ignored. He signed the authorization that kept the post-September 11th internal review, the one congressional investigators described only as significant, at Top Secret/SCI. None of that makes him guilty of anything. Correlation is not causation. A director presides over his agency. Failures happen on directors' watches that directors didn't personally engineer. But here's what moves this from correlation to something harder to dismiss. In late July 2001, 6 weeks before the attacks, Hayden convened a senior staff meeting at Fort Meade. The existence of this meeting is documented in partially declassified congressional testimony from 2002. Its agenda is not. The names of everyone who attended are not. What was discussed is not. The record shows only that the meeting occurred, that it involved senior signals intelligence officials,
and that one of the items on the agenda was described in the partially declassified summary as Collection Priorities Reassessment. Collection Priorities Reassessment. In late July 2001. When the Joint Inquiry staff asked for the full meeting record, they were told it was classified at a level that prevented sharing with congressional investigators. Senator Graham's staff pushed back.
They were told the classification had been reviewed and upheld. They asked who had upheld it. The answer was the NSA Director's Office. Hayden's office had classified a document about a meeting Hayden had chaired. The Oversight Committee asking to see that document was told by Hayden's office that they couldn't see it. That is not an accusation. It is a documented fact about a documented process that produces a documented conclusion. We do not know what was decided at that meeting. We do not know what collection priorities were reassessed. We do not know who was in the room or what they knew at the time. What we know is that 6 weeks later, the attacks happened, and that in the months after the attacks, Hayden oversaw the largest expansion of warrantless domestic surveillance in American history, a program called Stellar Wind, authorized by executive order and kept secret from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court entirely. The legal framework that had supposedly prevented the NSA from acting on its pre-9/11 intelligence, the FISA wall, the posse comitatus restrictions, the legal constraints that the lawyers had cited when they blocked Able Danger, those constraints were dissolved almost overnight after September 11th. Not through legislative reform, through executive order. The same agency that had cited legal barriers to sharing intelligence about Mohammed Atta in 2000 was, by late 2001, running warrantless surveillance on American citizens without a court order. The barriers that prevented action before the attacks came down immediately after. The programs that couldn't be funded before the attacks received virtually unlimited funding after. The authority that couldn't be claimed before the attacks was claimed by executive order within weeks. Binney noticed this. He said publicly that the infrastructure of Stellar Wind, the mass surveillance architecture that the NSA built after September 11th, bore a specific resemblance to a version of ThinThread that he had proposed years earlier, a version that had been rejected. The difference was that his version had privacy protections built in. The post-9/11 version didn't. Someone wanted the capability without the constraints. Remember Bogdan Zukovich, the FAA Red Team investigator who found that 80 to 90% of mock weapons passed through airport security undetected, who filed a classified report, who was told to soften his findings, who testified to the 9/11 Commission and was not named in the final report. In 2004, Zukovich filed a formal whistleblower complaint with the Office of Special Counsel. The complaint alleged that FAA leadership had deliberately suppressed security vulnerability findings to protect the airline industry from costly upgrades. The Office of Special Counsel investigated for 4 years. In 2008, they issued a finding. They found that the FAA had indeed suppressed the findings. They recommended corrective action. No corrective action was taken. No one was disciplined. The FAA officials who had ordered the reports softened had long since retired. The airlines had long since received their bailout after September 11th, $15 billion in direct aid and loan guarantees authorized by Congress within 11 days of the attacks. The industry that benefited from the suppressed security reports received federal compensation for the consequences of the attack that the suppressed reports might have helped prevent. Now close the loop on the 28 pages. The Joint Congressional Inquiry completed its final report in December 2002. 28 pages of that report, a full chapter, were classified at the direction of the Bush White House before publication. The stated reason was protection of intelligence sources and methods. For 13 years, those pages sat in a locked room in the Capitol. Families of victims were allowed to read them under conditions that prevented any notes or descriptions from leaving the room. In July 2016, the pages were released, partially. The released version contains redactions, black bars, some covering single words, some covering entire paragraphs. What remains readable describes in specific terms relationships between several of the September 11th hijackers and officials connected to the Saudi government. It describes financial flows. It describes contacts between hijackers and individuals with known ties to Saudi intelligence. It does not conclude that the Saudi government directed the attacks. What it establishes, in the language of intelligence assessments carefully hedged, is that individuals connected to the Saudi government provided material support to at least some of the hijackers. 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals. The Saudi government was one of the United States government's most important strategic partners in the Middle East. The week after September 11th, while American airspace was closed to civilian traffic, members of the bin Laden family were permitted to fly out of the United States on chartered aircraft. This was confirmed by the 9/11 Commission. The Commission found no evidence that the FBI had been given the opportunity to interview the departing Saudi nationals before they left. The intelligence relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia is among the most sensitive and most classified in the American national security apparatus. What the NSA was collecting on Saudi government communications in the summer of 2001, and what it found, and what was done with those findings, remains almost entirely classified. When Sybil Edmonds translated intercepts that referenced pre-9/11 foreknowledge, some of those intercepts involved communications that touched on American relationships with foreign governments in the Middle East. She cannot say more than that. The retroactive classification order prevents her. She has said, in terms that skirt the edges of what she's legally permitted to say, that what she found was not about the NSA missing a signal. It was about a signal the NSA had that was never meant to be acted upon. Try to hold that against the architecture of everything else. ThinThread, a program that would have automatically processed and flagged that kind of signal, canceled. Able Danger, a program that had already identified the lead hijacker, restricted. The FAA Red Team findings, security vulnerabilities that would have complicated the method of attack, suppressed. The 28 pages, documentation of foreign government support for the hijackers, classified for 13 years. The NSA internal review, classified at the director's level, with content described only as significant. The July 2001 meeting, classified, agenda unknown, attendees partially unknown. Every point at which the attack might have been interrupted, every point at which the foreknowledge might have become actionable. Closed, restricted, suppressed, classified. Now go back to Able Danger, back to Anthony Schaefer and the photograph of Mohammed Atta. Schaefer has said in interviews, in congressional testimony, in his book before it was purchased and shredded by the Defense Intelligence Agency, that Able Danger's identification of Atta was not the only identification the program made. The program identified a cell, multiple individuals, connected, operating inside the United States. The cell was mapped. Its connections were documented. That documentation, the full Able Danger archive, was ordered destroyed in 2000 by the Special Operations Command before the September 11th attacks. The order cited privacy concerns about data collected on American persons. But the destroyed data, Schaefer has testified, contained foreign nationals, including Atta, including at least 2 other individuals who would later be identified as hijackers. The destruction order was issued by an attorney in the command's legal office. That attorney's name is not in the public record.
The chain of authority above that attorney, who gave the instruction, who reviewed the decision, who signed off, is not in the public record. The 9/11 Commission was given the name of the attorney. They did not include it in the final report. The Commission's defenders have one consistent response to all of this. The individual failures, they say, were real, but the failures were the result of a broken system, siloed agencies, outdated technology, Cold War bureaucratic structures that hadn't adapted to a new threat environment.
The reform that followed, the Director of National Intelligence, the restructuring of FISA, the information sharing requirements, those reforms addressed the real problems. And then they ask you to look at the result. No major domestic terrorist attack since September 11th. The system, broken as it was fixed. Here's what that argument requires you to ignore. The reforms that followed September 11th massively expanded the power and budget of the agencies that failed. The NSA went from a budget that was classified but estimated at roughly $6 billion annually to a budget that, by 2013, when Edward Snowden's leaks first made it visible, was $10.8 billion annually, confirmed in the classified black budget that Snowden released. The CIA, the FBI, the DHS all expanded enormously in funding, in legal authority, in reach. The agencies that failed were rewarded with exactly what agencies want: more money, more power, less oversight.
If you designed a system where failure produced those outcomes, you would design it to fail. Thomas Drake is retired now. He speaks occasionally at civil liberties conferences. His security clearance is gone. His career is gone. He talks about what he found in the post-September 11th internal review with the precision of someone who has thought about it for 20 years and knows exactly which words will and won't trigger a federal response. He says this: the NSA had the information it needed. The problem was never collection. The problem was disposition. What you do with what you have. And the decisions about disposition, what to act on, what to share, what to file away, what to cancel, those decisions were made by people, specific people, with specific motivations. And those motivations were not always, or even primarily, national security. He says it carefully. He says it quietly. And then he stops, because he knows where the line is, and he's crossed it enough times to know what happens when you cross it without proof that can survive a federal courtroom. The proof that can survive a federal courtroom is still classified. That's the answer to the question you've been building toward for the last hour. Not a revelation. A wall. A specific, documented, legally enforced wall between what happened and what the public is permitted to know about what happened. Bill Binney identified the hijacker network in an NSA database in 2002, running a test of ThinThread's post-cancellation capability. He found them, retroactively. He demonstrated that the program he built would have flagged the hijackers' communication patterns before September 11th. He presented this finding to NSA leadership. They classified it. The finding that a canceled program would have identified the hijackers is itself classified. You cannot see it. The people who have seen it are bound by their clearances. The congressional staff members who were briefed on it signed non-disclosure agreements as a condition of the briefing. What a democracy does with proof of its own failure, when that proof is more embarrassing than the failure itself, is this: it classifies the proof. Now close the final loop, the first one. September 10th, 2001, Fort Meade, Maryland. 2 intercepts, Arabic. Tomorrow is 0 hour. The match is about to begin. The NSA has confirmed the intercepts exist. They've confirmed they were translated on September 12th. They've given 2 explanations over the years for why they weren't translated on September 10th. The first explanation: a backlog of untranslated intercepts. The agency was receiving more Arabic language communications than its translation staff could process in real time. The intercepts were queued, standard procedure, unfortunate timing. The second explanation, offered only after the first was challenged by former NSA Arabic translators who said the backlog in that specific collection stream was not unusual and would not have delayed a flagged communication by 24 hours, was different. The intercepts, according to the revised account, had not been flagged for priority translation. They were collected as part of routine monitoring of a known communications channel and sat in the queue at routine priority. Who sets priority flags on collected intercepts? Analysts, and the algorithms, the automated systems that assist them. In 2001, those systems were not ThinThread. ThinThread had been canceled. The system in use was an older, less capable platform that relied more heavily on human analyst judgment and less on automated pattern recognition. Bill Binney has said, with the specificity of someone who built the alternative, that ThinThread would have flagged those intercepts automatically.
The phrase 0 hour in the context of a known al-Qaeda communications channel would have triggered an immediate priority escalation. The intercepts would have been translated within hours, not the following day. But ThinThread was gone. The intercepts sat in a queue, and at 8:46 in the morning on September 11th, American Airlines Flight 11 hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 2,977 people died that day. Each one of them was at a specific place, at a specific time, for a specific reason that had nothing to do with the decisions made inside Fort Meade and the Pentagon and the CIA's Langley headquarters in the months and years before. A woman at her desk on the 94th floor, a firefighter climbing a stairwell, a passenger who had boarded a flight to visit family or for a business meeting or coming home. None of them knew about ThinThread. None of them knew about Able Danger. None of them knew about the July 2001 meeting, whose agenda is still classified, or the internal NSA review, whose contents are still classified, or the 28 pages whose full unredacted version is still classified. They didn't need to know. They were supposed to be protected. Here's where this leaves us, not with a verdict, with a weight. The official story asks you to believe that September 11th was a failure of imagination, that no one could have connected the dots. But the dots were connected. Able Danger connected them. ThinThread was designed to connect them. The NSA analyst who flagged two hijackers' names connected them. The dots existed. What failed was not imagination. What failed, or what was made to fail, was the mechanism that turns connected dots into action. And the people who tried to fix that mechanism, or who tried to explain why it failed, or who tried to bring what they found to the public record, those people were not thanked. They were not promoted. They were not given a platform. They were prosecuted, raided, retroactively classified, buried alive in windowless offices, driven to bag groceries. 23 years later, the key documents are still classified. The July 2001 meeting agenda is still classified. The Able Danger archive is still destroyed. The full 28 pages are still partially redacted. The NSA's internal post-September 11th review, the one described only as significant, is still top secret/SCI. Michael Hayden went on to become director of the CIA. He served on the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. He became a CNN national security analyst. He published a memoir. He was never called before a grand jury. He was never asked, under oath, about the July 2001 meeting. He was never asked, under oath, about the ThinThread cancellation's specific timing. He appeared on television after the Snowden revelations to argue that mass surveillance was necessary and legal. The journalists who interviewed him did not ask about Able Danger. They did not ask about the September 10th intercepts. They did not ask about Bill Binney. Bill Binney was not on television. There's one more thing, a detail that has never received the attention it deserves, partly because it requires you to hold 2 decades of context in your head at once to understand what it means. In 2013, Edward Snowden's leaks revealed the full scope of the NSA's post-September 11th surveillance architecture. The mass collection of phone metadata, the PRISM program, the tapping of fiber optic cables, the collection of hundreds of millions of communications daily involving American citizens without individual warrants. When those programs became public, the government's defense was consistent. This surveillance is necessary to prevent another September 11th. The scale of collection is required because we cannot know in advance which communication will be the crucial one.
Bill Binney read that defense, and he said publicly that it was false. Not the intent, the factual claim. The NSA didn't need mass collection to prevent another September 11th. He had built a program that could have done it with targeted, privacy-protected, legally authorized collection. That program had worked. It had been canceled. The mass surveillance architecture that was built after September 11th, justified by September 11th, funded by September 11th. That architecture was not the lesson learned from the failure. It was the version of the capability that the people who canceled ThinThread had wanted all along. They got it. In the end, they got everything they wanted. The budget, the authority, the architecture, the legal framework, the public acquiescence of a population that had just watched nearly 3,000 of its citizens die and would accept almost anything in the name of making sure it didn't happen again. What they gave up in exchange was accountability. The closed-door meetings, the classified reviews, the retroactive classification orders. The whistleblowers processed through the system until they were silent or broken, or both. That's the trade. That's what the documents, the testimony, the FOIA fights, the congressional footnotes, the books that were purchased and shredded all point toward, in their different ways, from their different angles. Not a single mastermind, not a room where someone decided 3,000 people would die. Something more diffuse and more durable than that. A system that valued its own continuity over the safety of the people it existed to protect. A system that, when its failures became visible, classified the visibility. A system that is still running, with a larger budget, more legal authority, better technology, and no one who has ever tried to explain what it knew before September 11th and what it chose to do with that knowledge has ever been allowed to finish that explanation in public. There's a box of documents at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Series RG-263. It relates to post-September 11th intelligence reviews. Most of it is available for public inspection. 17 folders in that box are withheld in full. The reason given on the withdrawal notice for each of the 17 folders is the same 4 words. Currently not available for review. No classification level, no exemptions cited, no date of anticipated release. Just those 4 words on a standard government form in a box anyone can request. 17 folders. No one knows what's in them. No one who has asked has been told when they'll be available. The withdrawal notices are undated. They've been sitting there since 2004.